Back when I was in school, I was constantly looking for tips to improve my renderings. And that resulted in going down a lot of YouTube rabbit holes, learning about obscure 3ds Max materials, modeling, or lighting. All sorts of things that if you aren't versed in rendering, no one will ever pick up on or care about. So I want to share the biggest tips I've picked up over the years that improved my renderings and help focus you so that you can go about improving yours, which, spoiler alert, have nothing to do with Max or any specific rendering program. So close Max, grab a coffee, and let's get into it. My number one tip to improve your renderings is to treat rendering like photography. Just get into that mindset. After this video, I want you to go find a photo blog or some YouTuber who just talks about improving photography. Seriously, this is one of the cool things about architectural renderings. They're very technical to put together, but at the end of the day, what you're producing is art. It's essentially CGI photography. And if you treat renderings like photography, you're gonna have a much better time and produce better images. Once you're able to understand the keys to just crafting a high quality image, you'll start finding the actual reasons for placing particular trees, furniture, or choosing certain colors. That's what I think starts to separate people who just jump into Lumion and expect instant perfect renderings and someone who can actually produce something a client will gleefully sign off on from any rendering program. Don't get lost in the weeds of Max thinking some new setting will be the key to a perfect image, because settings will never fix a poorly composed image. The time you put into understanding basic photographic principles will give you a much larger return on your time than learning how to put displacement maps on rocks, which, yeah, I can make some pretty dope rocks. Number 2, composition / rule of thirds. This is photography 101 and you've probably heard of it. Imagine a grid splitting your frame into thirds. Whatever the main subject of your image is, stick it on one of the lines crossing the thirds. Your horizon line, shoot for it to be on one of the thirds. The front door of your building, stick it on one of the thirds. There's all sorts of psychology on this, but for our purposes, things just feel more balanced when your subject isn't put straight in the center of the shot. It's probably one of the easiest, most basic things you can do that will set you up for success. I've seen so many examples of people who just point the camera straight at the building without any thought to this and think it looks fine. Just do it, get it ingrained, and it'll be second nature. Number 3, your eye loves contrast. Whatever part of your image has the most contrast, meaning the greatest local difference between a light and a dark, is often the first thing that your eye is drawn to when you look at an image. Don't just take my word for it. Go look critically at a bunch of images on your own. It could be any image, not just architectural photography. Your eye will jump to where there's contrast. And it's a cool thing to know because you can use this to help make your subject pop and be the first thing that the viewer sees. Whether it's a cool front door, a neat architectural feature, a specimen tree, try to craft your image so that the subject that you want the viewer to be drawn to has some good contrast to it. If you put that high contrast point according to the rule of thirds, you're crushing it. Number 4, warm colors will pop relative to cool colors. By warm, I mean yellows, reds, and oranges versus cooler colors like blues and purples. Placing these colors next to each other adds a subtle bit of depth to the image. You see this all the time with night renderings when the warm interior lights really pop and add a lot of drama compared to a blue night sky. More commonly, everyone has seen this exact same principle applied to movie theaters using the orange and blue. Go Google it. Totally same logic, and once again, you might not unsee this one either. But honestly though, color theory is a pretty deep and fascinating topic, but for our purposes, we can keep it simple. If you have some grass in the foreground, just tweak the hue a little bit to be a little warmer of a green, and it'll pop in the foreground compared to a blue sky in the background. You can have warm greens and cool greens, so be cognizant of what you're doing and get creative. Number 5, hierarchy. You want there to be layers to your images so that your viewer's eye moves around in some semi-structured way. You should always have a focal point, which is the main subject, but then you want to have a few other things in your image that your viewer's eye can move around to that isn't as dominant as the main subject. This could be a light and lacy specimen tree or some mountains in the background. They can all be arranged so that the viewer has multiple things to look at, and they should be composed so that they aren't competing with each other. There are a ton of techniques you can use to achieve this, such as color, size, contrast, and leading lines, which actually leads us to our next point. Number 6, leading lines. You can use elements in your image to help nudge your viewer's eye around in a particular way. The perspective lines in an image often aid in this, as they can often create a natural sense of movement just by the way that the building lines move across the composition. Maybe you have a small footpath in the foreground that leads toward your front door. The horizontal silhouette of a mountain range might draw the viewer across the image. Again, it's completely up to you how you accomplish this, but it's a cool, subtle way to try to guide your viewer around the image. Number 7, foreground and background. Similar to hierarchy, you might want to consider putting objects in front of and behind your building. A lot of the time you'll often get a branch or something hanging into the shot, and that helps ground the image and create a bit of placemaking. Filling out the background with trees, mountains, other buildings, etc., in conjunction with something in the foreground can add a lot of depth and richness if done properly. Which also leads us to number 8. Things in the distance always fade out a little bit. I don't know the exact science behind it, but as you look at objects in the distance, you'll notice they always have a lightened or faded look to them. It's the type of thing you can easily pull off for your backgrounds in Photoshop with the lightness slider and a hue adjustment layer. Using your watercolor passes, just mask out whatever you want to look farther back and just pump up the lightness a bit. It can be a really easy and subtle way to just separate your building from the background. Number 9 is case studies. Don't import your model and just start setting cameras and materials and stuff up. Take the time to compile a list of images from your favorite render artists that you or your client really like and use them to help inform your image. And I promise, if you synthesize a handful of different techniques from a few different sources and apply them to your unique design, you'll end up with something totally unique to you. Number 10, be critical. At the end of the day, a rendering is CGI. It's a fake image. Start training yourself to look for things that stand out and pull attention away from your building. To this day, whenever I do test renders, I'm constantly scanning the image for things that just look like shit and adjust. The type of things you look for might depend on how photorealistic you're trying to be. Essentially, the more photorealistic you go for, the more you have to worry about stupid little things that aren't actually related to the design, like adding a little dirt or leaves to a walkway. I personally try to find a balance where it's convincing enough that a client or someone will think it's photorealistic, but someone versed in renderings might still find all sorts of technical issues wrong with it. Just be wary of the uncanny valley, which is something looking close to real, but it just feels wrong because there's something off about it, but you just can't totally tell what. Constantly be asking yourself, why does the image look like shit? And try to fix the little things that bother you until you get to a point where no one's going to notice the remaining little things. Number 11 is to be intentional. Everything that you set up in your scene should be made with an intentional decision. The angle of the road crossing through, a branch hanging in the foreground, the amount of vignette that you start to apply. Start understanding what these things do relative to all the things that we've covered so far, and make sure they're accomplishing what you're intending them to. Unlike real photography, you have complete creative freedom in the image that you're making. Make sure that you know why you're making every decision that you do. And number 12 is to plan your scene before you get started. I always like to try to plan what I want to do regardless of what I know how to do in the actual program. And then I work my way into figuring out how to accomplish that thing in Max. I don't like to let the software dictate my creative choices. A little exercise to try is to sketch out what you're thinking. Consider your subject in the frame, your foreground elements, your background, the sun direction. I know architects tend to be more comfortable sketching, so maybe take 5 minutes to just jot down what you think the final scene should look like, and then go and make it in Max. It might help you stay in control a bit and avoid spinning your wheels on some little tiny settings or something that might not actually be any value to your final composition. So some of these might seem basic, some might overlap, but I promise if you try to keep all of these in mind while you're developing your technical skills in Max, you're gonna produce much better content. And at the end of the day, these are all just guidelines. You 100% can and should break them and do your own thing when you feel like it. But I do think it's important that you understand why you're doing what you're doing. As always, gently press the thumbs up button and subscribe if anything I've shared has been helpful. Please hit me up if you have any questions. I really do love hearing from you guys and seeing how you're doing. So have fun, and I'll see you next time.